In this screencast, I want to briefly talk about how to go about developing SQL queries to solve problems. That, for instance, is the whole point of databases, is to be able to reflect the real world and then to be able to answer questions about it for a large organization. For example, in a university, we want to answer questions like, what courses are most likely to cause a student to delay graduation? So we'd look in a database that keeps track of students' registration and their performance in those courses. So recall the structure of a typical SQL query from what we've learned so far. Namely, that it consists of a select clause, a from clause, a where clause, and an order by clause. And the from clause basically contains what data we're going to need to answer the question. The select clause limits the output to focus on the specific question. And then the condition tells you what tuples are most important for answering your question. So let's look at a specific example for the bakery database that is in your lab number 4. Find all the dates when Juliet Logan purchased cakes between October 15th and October 31st. Report the flavor, food, and date of its purchase. So this might be a question that comes up in some kind of marketing campaign. It wouldn't be specific necessarily to one customer, but you would want to know how good a customer they are in terms of how often they buy things and what specific things they're attracted to. So the first thing to do is to understand the database. And so for our bakery database, we do a show tables command, and we'd see that there are 4 tables in the database: a customers table, a goods table, an items table, and a receipts table. Neither one of just the names of the tables don't tell us much. So the next step will be to look at what each table represents. So what we'll do is we'll do a describe customers, and that'll give us this information in our lab application. Then we'll do describe goods, which will give us this information, items, etc. So we'll get the description of each one of the tables, and now we need to make a little bit of sense out of it and figure out what each table represents in its structure. So if you look at this, you'll see that the keys are, for the attributes that are the keys, are denoted for you, and either denoted by PRI or MUL. So PRI obviously represents its primary key, and MUL actually can represent a number of different things, but one thing it might represent is a foreign key. So let's look at that a little bit and see if we can determine how these different sources of data are linked to one another using foreign keys. So if we look at the mols, this one actually doesn't tell us too much here. It would probably be linked somewhere else in a larger database. This mol, same thing, but the mol here is an item, and we can, if we look at goods, we can see that it probably tells us which the actual item itself, gives us information on the item itself, the details for the item itself. So that's likely a foreign key. The customer field in receipts, that links up to the customer ID up in customers, the CID. And finally, the receipt number in items links down into the receipt. So from this, if you think about it, you can sort of get some idea of what's going on. The items, these regularly represent items sold, and each receipt is going to link down to the actual information about the sale date and the customer, and then this keeps track of the actual items. So there'll be multiple of these for each sale. So here's a simplified view of the previous slide showing the links and making it a little clearer what's going on. What you want to do with this picture is try to think of what the semantics are saying. Okay, so for instance, a receipt, you can have probably many different receipts that are linked to the same customer. you can have different items, right, on a particular receipt, and each item that it's the information on that item is reflected in the goods table. So we're going to use that sort of overview of how the database is set up to now answer our query. So now it's finally time to think about our query, that we have a pretty good understanding of the database. So we look at it and we say, well, what are we going to know? Which tables are we going to need to access? Well, we're going to need to access the customers table because we have to use the last name of the Juliet Logan. So we're going to have to use the names. And then because we're going to have to get cakes, that's going to be a food type. So we're going to need to access food, which is in the goods table. And we're going to need the sale date because we only want to look at things between October 15th and October 31st. So we'll need to look at the receipts table. And finally, we'll need to look at the items table because we need to link the goods to the receipts. So give that some thought. Make sure you understand the slide. There's a lot of meat in this slide in terms of linking the table structure here to the actual query. And again, the first thing is to figure out which tables you need for the data that's actually referenced in the problem, and then determine if you need any linkages between those tables in order to be able to link things up to be able to answer the question. So finally, this is what the query is going to look like. So we've got our 4 tables here that we're going to need to access, and we know what we want to output. We want to report on the flavor, food, and date of its purchase, so we're going to want all those things. And now we need to figure out how to express the linkages between the tables and the conditions for the tuples that we want to access. So we need the sales date. That's pretty obvious, between October 15th and October 31st. We need the person's name, that's Juliet Logan, and we need the food type, the cake, and then finally we need to make sure that all the tables are linked to one another, so we only get the tuples that we want. So we need to link the receipts table with the customers table, the receipts table to the item table, and then the item table to the goods table. And then finally, we want to order by the sales date to make it easier for us to understand the data. So this slide shows the output, and indeed it looks like we've got exactly what we need. If you wanted to check things, you might also output the last name, make sure you're getting Logan, and just to make sure that you've done the query correctly. So this is just a quick trip through a specific example to show you how to approach developing all the queries that you're going to have to do in Lab 4. So think about if you have any questions, and you can ask me about them in class.